is a family business. For most of the Potts children, their adult lives centered around this industry, becoming iron masters themselves, marrying iron masters, or being involved in the trade and shipping end of the business. It was a life they knew well, but that does not mean it was without its challenges. But certainly it was something that was integral to their identity as they grew up as Potts. We have mentioned Warwick furnace is the jewel of the Potts family crown. It produces pig iron, it casts stove plates, and eventually produces cannon during the American Revolution. It was completed by Ruth's mother, Anna Rutter Savage Nutt, after the death of her second husband, Samuel Nutt. Immediately, Anna has family involved in this business, with her son-in-law, Robert Grace, doing a lot of the business marketing side, and then, of course, John Potts as iron master. Eventually, many of John and Ruth's own children run Warwick as iron masters in their own right. John Jr. operated the furnace during the last few years of his father's life, and then bought it after his death, and held on to it for 2 years before selling it to his brother Samuel. Now, Samuel sells shares and half ownerships of the forge, but retains the majority share. Now, while the buying and selling amongst the siblings can get a little confusing and frustrating to completely understand what's going on, it does highlight how profitable Warwick furnace was, as it continuously cast pig iron and stove plates. This was the #1 producer in the Potts empire, and the Potts used iron from this furnace to send on to their own refinery forges to be further refined into iron goods, or they sold the pig iron directly. To help illustrate the value of this furnace, when John Potts Jr. sold it to his brother Samuel, he paid £8,500 for the furnace, a significant sum, especially when you compare it to a later 1772 indenture from Joseph Potts for an indentured servant Daniel McKay's labor for 4 years. He paid £15. Now, the history of the Potts' life at Warwick furnace continues throughout the 18th century, but we're going to come back to this story a little bit later. Warwick furnace is no longer standing. There are some ruins that you can go and see, but to truly get an understanding of what it took to operate an 18th century blast furnace, we're going to have to go on a little trip.
While we're here at Cornwall Iron Furnace, we'll be talking to Mike Emery, the historic site administrator here, and he'll be giving us an in-depth look at this furnace and also a look into the Potts' lives as iron masters. Hi Mike, we're so excited to be here at Cornwall Furnace. Can you just tell us a little bit about the history of the site?
Sure, Megan, I'd love to. So Cornwall Iron Furnace today is a 5-acre historic site located in Cornwall, Lebanon County. We began in 1742, ran until 1883. This is the most intact coal blast iron furnace that you'll find anywhere in North America. And it really is the pride of the area, but it's also something that can be enjoyed by people from out the Commonwealth, but also from beyond.
That's fantastic, thank you. So the Potts children, what we think of today as a young age, they would be starting out late teens, early 20s as a full leader in the Potts business. Could you tell me a little bit about what responsibilities the younger Potts would have been taking on at that time? And
they wouldn't have been alone really in taking on those types of responsibilities. If you think about the way that children, young adults would have been going into businesses in general, through an apprenticeship program. This is very much the same way, except they're not going to be a shoemaker, they're not going to be a blacksmith, they're going to ascend to this very high position of iron master. You know, one of the most complex industries that we had in Pennsylvania and colonial America. So they're going to have to learn all these different things, from what is the bookkeeping end of it. You know, they're going to know how to do that. I know here one of the problems, and it's something we don't think about, how do you pay for everything in a cash poor society? So gaining all these ideas on how access to capital. Some of it's going to be family, some of it's going to be from other merchants, how to go ahead and chase down people that are delinquent in a cash-poor society, which is always an issue throughout the 18th century. But then also how to make iron. What makes a good piece of ore? How do you assess it? How do you know that this piece of ore is richer than this piece of ore? And also to be able to look at the charcoal that's being produced, good charcoal from bad charcoal, and of course sourcing out limestone, and also just dealing with people, which of course is an ancient task for all of us. Who are the people that are telling you the story straight? Who are the ones that are maybe adding or embellishing more than what they're able to do?
Right.
So I think there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be, they're learning from leadership at the furnace that isn't family, but then also, probably sitting down with their father at some point and say, Dad, I had these issues. Could you go ahead and give me your years of experience? And, certainly then changing that father-child role, which had been, much different, but now it's a business relationship and a mentorship relationship. So I think that they would have seen a lot of that as well. And of course, you also had, I'm assuming that Thomas Potts had more than just sons, so they would have had daughters within the operation. Also, going in and having education, because that would be necessary. And then usually, looking at advantageous matches for those children, sometimes within other iron families or the merchant class in Philadelphia, or other people of like standing to be able to increase the family wealth going forward. Because certainly when we look at a lot of these iron families, it's a rather incestuous relationship where you have intermarriage amongst some of these same prominent families. And that's not by accident, of course.
No. Keeping the money in the family, definitely. So we are in this fantastic space here. Could you tell us a little bit about what this room is?
Well, this is probably one of the most iconic rooms that we have here at Cornwall. What we're standing in is the room that holds the blast apparatus. So one of the things that would have been necessary, aside from the iron ore, the limestone, and the charcoal, was the air to make that charcoal burn up to that 2,600 to 2,800 degrees. You need to introduce a tremendous amount of air. So in the 18th century, when the Pottses were making iron, it wouldn't have looked like this. This would have been bellows, just large fireplace bellows, about 20 feet long, usually operating in tandem. While one was filling, the other was blowing out. But by the time that our furnace was remodeled in the 1850s, this is what blast apparatus would look like. So we're no longer using bellows at that time, we're using blowing tubs. And this large wheel that you see here, this is what would have been helping to transfer the power from a steam engine, where we're no longer a water-powered operation by that time. We transitioned over to steam. And so this would have been part of transitioning of that power to the bellows, or again, the blowing tubs. But also this would have acted as a flywheel to go ahead and just keep everything going. So the big wheel that's in here, that's kind of the biggest piece here. It weighs about 4 tons, 24 feet across, and would have been going a fairly good clip. So lots of large things in here, a lot of danger.
Yeah, kind of on that point, with such big machinery, what kind of challenges and dangerous aspects of ironworking would the Potts children have faced?
There were really dangers at every point, not only for the Potts children, but especially for the workers. The idea of going and making charcoal. It's made from wood, and in a day when you didn't have chainsaws and trucks and cranes, so you had people that were dropping trees. So sometimes that goes as planned, other times it doesn't.
Right.
You had people that were making charcoal. Well, part of making charcoal was making sure that every once in a while they do what they call jump the pile, where they're standing on it to make sure there aren't any voids. Sometimes there are voids, so you go through into this hot thing of charcoal. Fire is a constant piece as well. They're introducing warm charcoal into a charcoal house. Sometimes it burns. Ours here at Cornwall burned twice.
Oh,
so you have those things. And then get into the mining. Everything's
Very
heavy,
dangerous,
everything's
yes.
big, and things tend to fall. And as you get into the 19th century, as people start using explosives, it gets even more dangerous as they're starting to up the amounts that are going there as well. And then once you get into the furnace itself, the hot metal and the slag that comes out. So we're in a big covered building. One of the reasons why we are is that hot metal and water don't mix. So if it gets water put onto it, it forms this skim that's on the outside. The steam inside, very rapidly expands and then blows liquid metal all over the room, not caring whether it's on people or anything else. So very painful. So yes, there's lots of opportunity to get hurt here. Even things and very little safety equipment. Your basic safety equipment is putting on as much clothing kind of as possible, so that you have very little skin exposed. You're only really looking through this amount. Putting water all over it. You're trying to stay distant from as far as you can, so you have long-handled instruments to do it. Wooden shoes, so that if you happen to step on something, you can smell the burning. It's not going to burn through the same way it would with a leather-soled shoe. So, the hot metal itself, and of course, heat exhaustion. There are records that say that when the metal was introduced to the casting room, temperature would spike up into the 150 plus range. People aren't designed to live in that sort of temperature shift. So there's just ample opportunities to get hurt in a furnace.
Absolutely. Here we are at the top of the furnace stack at Cornwall Furnace. This site, along with others strewn throughout Pennsylvania, are a great example of what the Potts children would have been working in and experiencing day to day as iron masters. Over here we have a prime example of one of the features that really showcases the environment of the furnace. Here we have a level for the fill that the workers would have moved up, and in the original wood we still have the scorch marks because the furnace would get to 26 to 2800 degrees Fahrenheit every day, and you can just see how hot and dangerous it could get in here. So at Pottsgrove Manor, we have the finished products. We have the firebacks, we have the pig iron. Here in the casting room of Cornwall Furnace, could you tell us a little bit about what it would have been like casting these products and what it really meant to the family to do so?
Well, this is where all the money was being made. This is where all the things from an iron plantation was feeding into this one room, because this is where items were being made from these just bits and pieces of, iron ore and limestone and charcoal. This is where it all came together. So you took things that were from the earth, from its raw state, and now we're making finished products from them, oftentimes embellished, oftentimes with owners' names on them as well. So like at Pottsgrove, here we were casting furnace plate or stove plates. So the stove plates that we had oftentimes were for 5-plate stoves, and they're being cast, even though we have an Irishman here casting things for Germans in German, they're still putting identifications on, knowing that it came from here, came from this family. And it really talks, I think, a lot about how not only is there the pride in what they're doing, not only is it advertisement, but this is something where people look that they were kind of building kind of generational wealth. And there was that pride also. And when you look at something like the Potts children, here you have a father looking at what can I pass on as a legacy to the next generation. Same thing was happening here, because you had multiple children. You had families then that are acquiring multiple properties that they could then put their children in charge of, but also really part out the family business. So you can see a lot of that happening right here. Again, this is where it's all being made, but this is also where the name is being affixed to everything. So it really does show that pride.
Absolutely. So thank you again, Mike. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for having us here. If you're interested in visiting Cornwall Iron Furnace,
well, you can come visit us. We're now open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Really, for up-to-date information, check out our website, cornwallironfurnace.org. Also, really look for our Facebook page. We update that quite regularly. If you're interested in lectures and other things that we do, you'll find all of that information there as well.
Awesome. This is a great site, and you guys should definitely check it out.
By the late 1750s, Thomas Samuel and John Jr. had teamed together to form Thomas Potts and Company, and they leased out several of the forges from the family, including Pine Forge, Potts Grove, as well as the Mountjoy Forge, and they also owned shares in Warwick Furnace. Now, there were a couple shaky financial years for the company, but they weathered through. At about the same time, Thomas was also involved in a business with his uncle, Thomas York. They owned a store in Philadelphia in which they had European goods as well as iron goods from the family for sale. This partnership did not prove as strong as the one that Thomas had with his brothers. Quickly, they found themselves in debt, at least £500, and £400 of that were from Thomas York. Quickly, creditors were called on York, and by 1762, things were very desperate. York and Potts collapsed, but the family was there to pick up the pieces. Thomas Potts and Company became responsible for the main distribution of Potts iron, and Thomas then teamed with his younger brothers, David and Joseph, to form a new store in Philadelphia on Water Street. Together, the brothers were involved from start to finish in the iron production and had found success, just like their parents had. Thomas Potts and Company eventually dissolved as the brothers did more individual business rather than as a team. This whole story really illustrates how the family comes together to support each other. And the sons, they're not the only ones who are pushing that family name forward. The daughters, they're never absent from the family business. The oldest two daughters, Martha, nicknamed Patty, who we met in our earlier video during the Gown for Martha project, and Anna Potts, are perfect examples of what it was like to be raised as an upper-class 18th century young woman. As Sarah explored, fine clothing and millinery was able to communicate these girls' upbringing and status instantly to 18th century eyes. And like most 18th century women, we don't have tons of information about their early lives, but we know about their marriages. Martha marries Thomas Rudder III, and after their marriage, they go to Coalbrookdale, and Martha returns to her childhood home of Popadicken. Just like her siblings, Martha's life was tied to the iron industry. Through this marriage, Rudder was able to buy and sell shares in family forges and furnaces, including Warwick Furnace. The couple is also involved in the start of early Pottstown. Eventually, they built a home in the town that was called Laurel Lodge.
Not every Potts child went immediately into the family business or married into that world. Two sons, John Jr. and Jonathan, went to Great Britain for their education. John Jr. went to London and became a lawyer, and Jonathan attended the University of Edinburgh with Jonathan Rush before having to quickly return home to his fiancée, Grace Richardson Potts. There, he continued his medical studies at the Medical College at the Philadelphia Academy. John Jr. later went on to be involved in the iron business, but once Jonathan graduated with his degree, he took his family to Reading, where he established his practice and opened an apothecary. Jonathan graduated in 1768, which is a very important and emotional year in the history of this family.
With so many of the Potts children now getting involved in the iron industry and taking over the operations of the businesses, this allowed John Potts to be able to go into politics and really focus on the development of Pottstown, which was incredibly important to him. However, in 1767, he starts to suffer a long and tedious illness that forces him to withdraw from public life and responsibilities. And on June 6, 1768, John Potts does pass away. 1768 is a huge year in Potts history. Just a few weeks after his father passes, Jonathan graduates as valedictorian from his medical school, and in December of that year, Anna Potts is married.
This is her dowry chest, a mix of traditional English and German styles and decoration. We can only imagine what an emotional day it might have been for her. Anna was marrying someone she knew well, and a life she perhaps knew even better. Anna married her half-cousin, David Potts, and with that, helped to consolidate the family business, and the young couple went to Pine Forge. Just like her mother and older sister Martha, Anna furthered the family business through her marriage, but unlike her mother and sister, John was no longer alive to guide the family industry together.
John's incredible influence over his children cannot be understated, and his will gives some peek into family dynamics. In this extensive document, he lists what properties he wants to be sold and how assets are to be divided. When it comes to inheritance, Thomas and David get £750 each. Thomas because of the significant losses he had while in business with his uncle Thomas York, and David because he had been injured by the stroke of a mare. Then Samuel, Joseph, Isaac, James, and Jesse are given £250 each. John Jr. and Jonathan are given less because of the considerable expense of their education. Additionally, most of the boys receive some sort of land or other asset. Martha received £950, and John specifies that all of his children should have an equal share of the estate. Rebecca Potts, the third daughter, she was 13 at the time John Potts passed away. Her younger brother Jesse was 11, and the baby, Ruth Jr., was 9. John specifies for his minor children that they be brought up and educated out of the general estate fund, not out of their own inheritance. They still grew up in a similar style to their older siblings, even though their family life was dramatically changed. While John does leave specific details about how he wants land sold and assets divided, after his death, the children seem to do their own wheeling and dealing. Samuel is left as the executor of the estate, and he and John Jr. seem to work out slightly different terms for Warwick Furness than what was specified in the will. But there is a tremendous amount of land being sold back and forth between these siblings for several years after John's death. So clearly, they're absolutely living up to his legacy on how to do business within the family. The Mount Joy Iron Works, today known as Valley Forge, is a smaller but important part of the Potts Empire. Purchased in 1757 by John at a sheriff's sale, he eventually expanded it to include a merchant mill and sawmill. He leased it out to lots of different companies over the years, most of which involved his children. Thomas, Samuel, John Jr., Joseph, David, and Isaac Potts are all connected to the Mount Joy Iron Works at some point. After John's death, it transfers hands a few more times, but eventually really David Potts and William DeWeese own and operate the forge, and Isaac Potts owns and operates the mill. Life in the quiet area of Valley Forge was about to be turned on its head in 1777. The British were moving through the area as part of their Philadelphia campaign, and the colonial government had stored huge amounts of supplies at the forge, which of course made it a target for the British. The British came in September of 1777, and they burned the forge, sawmill, 2 stone homes, 2 coal houses, and took 2,000 bushels of wheat and rye. Now, the war was not about to leave the Potts at Valley Forge alone. 3 months later, a new army comes and encamps at the Valley Forge. The mill house Isaac owned was leased by his aunt, Deborah Hughes, at the time, and then she actually subleases it to Washington to use as his headquarters. She's the one who actually signs the paperwork. Isaac was up in Pottstown running a tannery at the time of the Valley Forge encampment. And there's also evidence that from his marriage, he became a devout and practicing Quaker. So he could have been strongly against any type of war and violence. We can imagine this, though, how difficult it might have been to see one army destroy your property and another inflict long-term damage upon your business. It was a different world that Isaac and his brothers had to navigate at Valley Forge than the one that John and Ruth had experienced. One other Potts child, Jonathan Potts, is strongly connected to the Valley Forge story, as he was a doctor in charge of hospitals while the troops were encamped there. You can actually find out more about his life in a video that we have that is focused entirely on his story and experiences. Just like in peacetime, Warwick Furness remained central to the Potts throughout the war. Samuel Potts had the majority share of Warwick and was eventually working with Thomas Rudder III, Martha's husband. In 1775, the Committee of Safety wanted to build up their supply of cannon, probably sensing the impending conflict. Potts and Rudder were given £1,000 in advance for cannons that were cast at Warwick. It seems like cannon was not something they normally made because it took them almost a year to test and perfect their casting. By the end of September 1776, Warwick had produced 60 cannon, 23 12-pounders, and 37 18-pounders. Potts and Rudder were then paid an additional £3,000 for their work. Warwick completed a few more cannon casting contracts, and these records can be interpreted as the patriot sympathies of Potts and Rudder. We also can't ignore that they are incredibly profitable. Most of the Potts children certainly lean towards the patriot side, but records also indicate that they're thinking about the survival of their businesses first and foremost. The Revolutionary War really highlights how the Potts children are complicated and don't always fit into a nice category all the time. The youngest four children, James, Rebecca, Jesse, and Ruth Jr., are all a little younger during the Revolution and experience it slightly differently. James actually becomes a lawyer, and he's elected as a Whig to the provincial council and practices law in Philadelphia before his early death in 1788. Rebecca Potts actually marries Dr. Benjamin Duffield in 1778, and the young couple go up to Reading. Jesse was just like many of his siblings and entered into the iron industry, working at several forges and furnaces after the Revolution. And of course, he teams up with his brothers in many ways, especially Thomas and Samuel. And finally, Ruth Jr. has several different family stories about her because she doesn't marry until she's 44 to a man named Peter Laura, who's a shipbuilder. She lives in Pottstown, actually occupying the same lot that her mother Ruth lived at until her death. Even though there are 25 years, a quarter of a century between the oldest and youngest Potts, the Revolution really shows us how intertwined all of their lives are. Growing up Potts meant they're focused on the family business and the family name, independently running businesses, but also relying on siblings. Clearly, the family name meant a lot to each child, and they worked to continue that success of the family. Today, we measure the success in business stories and family records and their material culture. But perhaps the greatest measure of the family is how we still share their lives and stories today.